Morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Dripps. I'm the account technology strategist, along with Bill Barkovic, who's our modern workplace specialist, and Brian Jameson, our security specialist. And we are just part of the larger Microsoft tribal account team within the federal group at Microsoft. And as we work with different tribal communities and organizations, we hear a lot of common problems and concerns, and those mainly focus around security. Security around data, security around remote users, and obviously concerns about data sovereignty. So as we work with you guys, we understand a lot of the risks that you face and the things that potentially keep you up at night. Security, of course, is paramount and should always be top of mind, and which I'm sure it is with you as well. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can support your employees that are working remotely. Our next series will be in 2 weeks, protecting your sensitive information using Azure Information Protection and some of our other solutions around data loss prevention. And following that, we will be talking about how to strengthen your security posture with some of our other solutions. We will have a Q&A available during this seminar and do our best to answer as many questions as possible. But if we don't get to your questions right away, we'll be sure to follow up directly afterwards. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Jameson, our Microsoft Security Specialist. Brian?
Thanks, John, and thank you all for attending today. So today we want to focus, as John mentioned, on enabling our workforce to be productive from an organizational perspective, but also to be safe, and for us as an organization, or you as an organization, to be comfortable that the transactions and what's happening from your end user perspective is not putting the organization at risk, right? And so we do that, and this is a industry-wide term. For those who are familiar with the TIC 3.0 standards that come out from the federal government for certain agencies, it is directly in line with a lot of that, right? And so we'll talk about that today. How do we enable productivity with our workforce being remote sometimes, and even when they come back into the office, right? How do we ensure that what they're doing and what's happening in the organization is safe, secure, and we're able to respond to it in a decent time frame? And so we do that by embracing zero trust. And so zero trust really falls into three categories, or there's three principles, right, that zero trust falls under, right? So the first principle is to verify explicitly, right? We want to authenticate, and we're going to look at two entities, and you'll see this theme throughout today's discussion. So when your users are remote, when your contractors, employees, all the type of categories of persons who interact with your organization, we want to do certain things from a verify explicitly perspective. We're going to always authenticate them, and we're going to always authorize them on every request, right? And we're going to look at the devices and those individuals, right, or those identities, right? And we're going to look at what they're bringing to the table, as we say, right? What telemetry do you bring with you? And what will allow me to verify that you aren't exposing the organization to a risk, right? And that's that, looking at those various data points: location, is my device healthy, compliant? What data am I going after, right? That's part of that verification process. And are there any anomalies, right? We're going to talk about some of that signal that comes in from that verify explicitly swim lane, right? The second principle of zero trust, and again, a theme you're going to see throughout today's discussion, is we want to maintain a least privileged posture when it comes to interacting with the organization, right? We always mention, for those who are familiar with the Superman or Marvel series, right? You want to walk around as Clark Kent. That's the business person who doesn't have all the Superman powers, and only allow Clark Kent to be Superman, right, when necessary, or when he needs to be, right? And that's that least privilege mindset, just in time and just enough access, right? We'll talk about that a little later. You also have to be in that least privilege principle mindset, be able to do adaptive, or I like to call it dynamic policies, right? As my posture changes as an end user, right, I could be healthy, doing the proper things in the morning, but after lunch, now I'm coming in from a Tor browser, or I'm coming in from a bad reputation IP, right? We have to dynamically adapt to who I am as an identity or what my device is doing, and be able to protect the organization appropriately. And then finally, the third zero trust principle that everything is built on, what we're going to talk about today, to enable your workforce to work remotely in a smart, secure manner, is the assumed breach, right? We not a scare tactic, right? But I'm sure all of you, right, have part of your standard operating procedures on what do we do when X happens, right? And so you have to assume that breach mindset, right? And so what does that mean, right? It's not walk around being fearful and, oh my gosh, what's going to happen, right? But how do we move quickly? How do we prevent lateral movement or identity escalations, right? Someone going from a standard user and then that bad actor getting a hold to an administrative level privilege account, right? How do we verify that all sessions are encrypted, right? To then minimize the blast radius, if you will, of something happen and that breach happens. Again, and then lastly, more importantly, how do we use analytics, right, to get visibility and orchestrate telemetry that's coming in to drive detection, to drive risk mitigation, right? And so these are the principles that'll get you as an organization to a level where your remote contractors, employees, or your remote users can securely and safely interact with your organization, right? Verify explicitly, least privilege, and assume breach. Now, I talked about the control strategy a bit here, but I'm going to go into it a little deeper as we move forward here. So there's three things that happen all the time on every session request, or that should happen all the time on every session request, right? They always get the analogy, well, we have a VPN, or we're coming back and we're using some direct connection from a cloud resource back home, even if it's creating a circular route. So as long as they're there, we're gonna trust them, right? They've gotten onto the VPN, so great. Well, not so fast, right? Are you able to do these things even though they're on the proper communication channel, right? Taking a look at your signal, right, to make an informed decision on what to do with this request, right? And so is the device, and again, you'll see this theme, there's two signal inputs that we constantly take a look at, right? The first signal input is the actual, the actual device, right? And what's happening from a device perspective. Is it being managed? Is it compliant? Is it not compliant? Were there threats seen on that device, right? And if so, maybe I want to do something different. Is that device currently under quarantine, right? Have I seen this device before, right? Those are some of the signals that come in when you're first deciding what to do in this zero trust access control strategy. Never trust, but always verify. On the user side, from a signal perspective, right, we take a look at things from, do we have to MFA you? What behavior have you shown as a user, right? What groups are you in? Are you a, senior level user, or are you a least privileged user, right? We take a look at that signal, and we have to be able to collect that signal in order to make an informed decision. And so that's the first part of zero trust, and how you control that access to the resources that you're going to give them access to. Can you obtain this signal on every single request, right? Now that you have the signal, right, and you're marching through deciding what to do with this particular request from a user who's remote, now we have to do some decisions based off of your organization policy, right? So now you say, if, right, I'm coming from a device that is not compliant, do something, right? I'm looking at that signal that I got, and I'm using my organizational policy that you as an organization make from an IT security, SecOps, you name it, right? Based off of what I know, here's how I want to treat this particular request, right? But we also have the ability in that decision frame, and you'll see a little later, where we can do dynamic or decisions, right? So if I'm risky, well, how do you define risky? I'll show you that a little bit later. Is my device at risk, right? And what is the risk score? And you have to be able to take a thorough look from an analytical perspective on that signal that's coming in to make informed decisions and be able to react on every single session request. And then some of the decisions there, am I going to allow full access, increase assurance, MFA, right? Limit access, they want to block altogether, right? That's the decision point that you have to make using your organizational policy. And then finally, right, as part of this zero trust access control strategy, you want to look at enforcement, right? All of these things are great. I'm gathering telemetry, right? I'm gathering signal. I'm mapping my organizational policy to what I'm getting in from a signal perspective. I'm being dynamic, right? If I'm looking for impossible travel, I've done all the heavy lifting, right? But I have to also do the enforcement piece. And I can't just do it in one realm, right? And that's where that's where the zero trust really finishes off this point of zero trust access control strategy. I have to enforce that policy or that decision channel, right, across modern applications, SaaS applications, legacy applications, or you name it, right? You have to be able to then take that with the decision point and do some level of enforcement. That's the zero trust access control policy strategy. Okay. So there's two real paradigms that have come about when you think about zero trust, right? And again, I'll refer back to that TIC 2.0 versus TIC 3.0, right? 2.0 was really somewhat close to this network paradigm here. And what we're talking about today is an identity base, right? Zero trust policy based off of access requests and your identity, right? And so I kind of march through the differences here really quickly. So on the network side of the house, right, you're looking at micro-segmentation of your networks, right? You're shrinking your network landscape to each server IP address. You're really marching through, and you're kind of deciding, who can do what based off of what network you're on, and separate out important things from a segmentation perspective. On the flip side of that, right, the identity side of the house, we do a dual perimeter, right? We add identities inside, defined by authentication and authorization. We coexist with what's happening on the network. And I'll show you some examples of that, right? Brian is coming in. I know who Brian is. I'm going to do some identity level signaling and decisions, but I also can do some network level decisions. Is he coming from a trusted network? Is he coming from a geolocation that's not approved, right? We can do a little bit of both there and coexist together. As far as the scope, right, on what network paradigm to zero trust can bring to the table versus the identity paradigm and what it brings to the zero trust discussion, this is really where that line, you start to see the line and start to see the benefits of the identity piece, right? From a network perspective, it's sort of limited to the networks. Your control doesn't span beyond your micro segmentation, period, right? That's where your control point lives. From an identity perspective, you can apply this to all of your assets, whether it's in the cloud, legacy assets via proxies, right? You're all over the place there on what you can control in the scope to where you can apply your zero trust. And so, the what makes it different here is, again, the scope, right, on where you can zero trust is enforced, and then the threat intelligence. How can you ingest what's happening here and map it and orchestrate it to other telemetry, right? Whereas you'll see, I'll show you in a bit here how the zero trust identity paradigm, right, how it integrates behavior, right? From your signal perspective, you can integrate machine learning across your assets to make decisions, right? Legacy assets are protected. And so you'll see how that all comes together. And so today's discussion is really going to focus on that identity side and how we take care of zero trust from an identity perspective. And this is the picture. If you notice in this picture, and I know I'm talking to my tribal and Alaskan Native entities, right? There's nothing on this picture that says Microsoft, I don't think. Yeah. So, but this is the picture, whether you're Microsoft or not, whether you're vendor X or vendor Z, right? This has to be what you're shooting for if you're going with the zero trust model, right? And so let's march through this really quickly just to explain what we're looking at here, because from this, right, is where I'm going to map you out into how we do it within Microsoft. For those of you who have M365, E5, you have this in your wheelhouse. You're ready to go. I can march you to it. If you have E3 or G3, we can talk about that and how we get you to 5 to really get you into this model. And so on the left here, let's look at the two things, and you'll see some things that we talked about before, right? Our inputs, right? We look at identities and devices. And the zero trust model says, great, I gotta know who my identity is, but now let's get some information from the provider. Let's be able to do some level of multi-factor authentication. As we all know from story after story, breach after breach, the general theme of all of them is, gosh, if they just had multi-factor authentication on, they probably could have gotten away from X breach, right? And then we take it a step further, zero trust, right? You have to be able to take a look at that user and that session and determine what the risk level is every single request. That's part of that telemetry. That's part of what feeds into your policy evaluation piece, which we'll get to in a second. On the flip side, not only am I looking at that identity, right, and doing all of these things, right, provider, MFA, user and session risk, I'm doing very similar things on the device side of the house. When you're looking at a zero trust model, you have to be able to accommodate corporate devices, corp issued devices, as well as unmanaged devices. Now, some of you will say, well, Brian, we don't allow unmanaged devices into our organization. It's just not part of what we do, and I don't know if we'll ever get there. Well, then your policy is, I don't want unmanaged devices touching any one of my resources. I don't even want an unmanaged device knocking at the front door, right? So it's still something you have to account for here. Now, once we know whether you're a corporate issued device or an unmanaged device, now is it part of your inventory? Because I could be a corporate issued device, but maybe I've opted out of being managed by the organization. Got to know that. I got to know the device identity, if it's a corp device or even an unmanaged device. I got to be able to determine, is this device risky and is it compliant to the compliance status that the organization has set in the organizational policy here, right? So now we got all this telemetry in a zero trust model. I looked at the identity, I looked at the device, I've gathered everything I needed to gather. Now let's apply that to the organizational policy, right? So you as an organization, your IT, admin, staff, or your SecOps or whomever, right? You guys are setting policy on how you want to deal with these two entities coming in to your environment to get access to your resources. And so you have to have, zero trust model says you have to have the security enforcement of your policy has to happen real time or near real time evaluation, right? So every single request, I can't come in at 8 o'clock, right? Make a request to get to send an email, right? And then come in at 9 a.m. and you trust me because I was just there an hour ago. No, zero trust model says every request I have to do real time policy evaluation, right? If you manage device and you are the chief information officer, then I want to treat you this way, right? That's the policy that you have to be evaluated against. And I'll show you an example on how we do it. All the while you're gathering this telemetry on the identities and the devices, all the while you're mapping and doing the evaluation against your organizational policy, the zero trust model says you have to have threat intelligence happening, right? That threat intelligence is not Brian, who's one of your best SecOps person, mining through logs and running scripts and commands and trying to see if anything looks suspicious there, right? This is real threat intelligence based off of trillions of bits of data that we do that's being recommended by the zero trust model. It's looking for orchestrated telemetry pieces, right? Think I got 10,000 devices, right? And I got 20,000 users, right? How do I then take all of that data and determine, wait, these 5 devices and these three users are under some level of risk, and you know what? They all kind of belong together. That's part of the same risk. That's that threat intelligence that has to be happening here during the policy evaluation period. So after you've gathered the telemetry from the identity and the device, I have to be able to apply threat intelligence to it, right? So now I've gotten through that, right? I've done the organizational policy evaluation. Now here comes the enforcement piece or the rendering of where you were trying to go as an end user, right? Whether I'm at Starbucks, whether I'm at a beach house or at home in my basement, this is what has to happen here. So now I can say, right, you can get to your emails or your structured data, but I'm going to take a look at, I got to be able to classify and label that data, right? Part of the zero trust model. Why do I need to classify and label documents? Well, it's going to get applied back to your policy evaluation, right? This feed is coming from this side as well. And so if Brian, who's coming from a corporate issued device and device is not risky and is compliant, and Brian as a user in his session is not risky, right, is trying to access data, but the data is labeled highly classified, and it should only be addressed from on-prem, then I can still say no, right? You got to understand what your data is and what you're dealing with before you render it to an end user. Now that matters in a zero trust model because if I'm a bad actor, right, I can limit the damage that could potentially happen because I understand my data. I know that I know as an organization that I want highly classified documents to only be accessed by a certain group of persons on corporate devices in a network that I trust. You've limited your risk landscape. You've reduced it, and thus you've helped yourself when it comes to mitigation. Same thing for applications, right? There's high business impact applications, there's medium, there's low, you can do it on an application by application basis, right? You have to have that adaptive access. Again, maybe I'm coming from an unmanaged device now and I'm going to a low business impact application. Great. Maybe I'm coming from a corporate device, but my device is marked non-compliant. Well, maybe I don't want you to get to that same application, or maybe I want you to do something different. Zero trust at its best. And the same can happen here on the infrastructure side of the house, from an IaaS or PaaS, right? Think what happens at access and runtime control to those infrastructures. Have to layer threat protection on what's happening here, right? If I'm seeing IP addresses with bad reputation, if I'm seeing communications here and things happening that is marked as a threat, I got to be able to identify that before I render it to an identity or device. Zero trust model. And finally, while all of this is happening, right? I'm gathering telemetry from my identities. I'm gathering telemetry from the devices. I'm doing real-time policy evaluation for my organizational policy. I'm looking at threat intelligence with everything that's coming in and out of this policy evaluation zone. I'm looking at what's coming in from data and how my data is classified and encrypted. I'm looking at my apps, my infrastructure, my network. While all that's happening, the zero trust model says, I got to be able to see all of that. I got to be able to put all this in a pond. And if I get a ripple in data, I have to see it over here in devices, right? If I got Brian behaving not so nicely here when he's dealing with a certain SaaS application, it has to be visible, and I have to apply analytics around that and be able to orchestrate all the telemetry that's coming in from all around. And zero trust model says, I got to automate this. I got to allow for playbooks and a certain level of automation, right? As we all know, humans can sometimes be the choke point in processes or the error prone point in processes, right? So how do we automate some things that we know is going to happen on a regular basis and focus our human resources on some of the more advanced hunting and advanced things that has to happen in this model? So the thinking is, if I can get to this trust model, right? Haven't talked about anything Microsoft yet, but if I can get to this trust model, you can be on Mars or Jupiter, a whole nother galaxy, and I can be assured as an organization that you're not putting me at undue risk. Will risk happen? The third part of the zero trust, of course, but because we have visibility and analytics across, before we have automation across, we can react to any of those breaches that could happen and that we're assuming will happen in the organization, because everything is visible and we're mapping out telemetry. That's the essence of zero trust. So let's talk about how we at Microsoft kind of view this, and I'll quickly go over this modern approach to this access, right? And so this is kind of lumping some of this together on what we just talked about, right? And how we view the landscape, right? So the modern approach says, I still got my two entities, right? I got my user risk, right? Do I want an MFA? Is impossible travel happening? Unusual location? I'm looking at behavior and anomalies here. I'm integrating with threat intelligence. We just talked about that. The modern approach says, I got to look at devices, right? We talked about compliant, managed versus unmanaged. Is it infected? All that signal, right? The decisions, right? And we talked about the decision piece in here, and we got to be able to remediate the user and device risk. So if either one of these, the user or device, ever trends into a risky posture, how do we remediate that, right? And that's part of that decision realm there. And then the enforcement realm, we break it into these four categories, right? Documents and data, modern applications and protocols, right? So, and if you see here, you're starting to see some names pop up, right? Not all Microsoft names. And that's because zero trust mandates that, right? It doesn't say Microsoft zero trust model. This is zero trust to doing business in your organization, right? And so you look at Office 365, Dynamics, AWS, whatever it is from a modern app and protocol perspective, it has to be able to feed into this, right? And be able to be evaluated and the like. Legacy applications, right? We can handle that with proxies, opportunity to reduce risk from full network access, right? We can point you directly to where you have to go via proxy or whatever the protocol, and put you under the same umbrella for continuous risk evaluation and remediation. And then finally, networking, right? Reduce the risk of using segmentation, threat protection, and encryption. So there you go. So that's the modern approach to that zero trust model. And so now let's talk a bit of product here. So on the user side let's back up. So these are the two inputs here, and I'm hoping that two things happen as part of this talk today. That you'll remember sort of the general flow of zero trust, but more importantly, that we'll send out some surveys and reach out as well. Let's have a detailed discussion about your organization and how you're doing. Right? Let's talk about where you fall into this model. Are you able to get to this model? And let us talk it through with you in more detail. But so here's where we start to plug in what we do. Now, I didn't mention it, and I got a slide here that talked about it before, but this piece here is the threat intelligence piece, right? Everything that we're going to show you from this point forward from a Microsoft perspective is built on what we call our Microsoft Intelligence Security Graph, right? This number here says 6.5, I think it's 8.2 trillion signals that we ingest per day. We see a lot. We see a lot of good activity. We see a lot of malicious activity. We see everything in between, right? And we base our security decisions and we analyze risk a lot of based on that signaling that we get, on top of the behavioral baselines and analytics that we have in your organization. So on the user side of the house, right, we take a look at the user and user threat and the risk signal that the user's generating. So we think of Azure Advanced Threat Protection here that I have listed here. That's what you're doing on your domain. Right? What's Brian identity? What has he done in the domain? Has he tried to get to some privilege level accounts that he doesn't have access to? That'll put him in a risky state, right? Is he trying to get into machines or servers that he has no business getting into, or typically hasn't gotten into before? Behavior baselining, that could be risky. We take a look at cloud, what you're doing in the SaaS realm from a user perspective. Is Brian doing, shadow IT? Is he going to unmanaged applications? Is he behaving in a not so nice manner against even applications that are corporate defined SaaS applications? We got to know that and make that part of that user threat and risk signal. We take a look at, from an Azure Azure Active Directory identity protection, has Brian's credentials been leaked on the dark web? Right? What behavior have we seen from Brian's identity, even out in the social realm? Is it part of some other attack or breach somewhere else? Once we've gathered that, right, we can make that part of Brian's user and session risk and feed it here into the conditional access. We take a look at how Brian authenticated, right? And should we apply MFA, right? What are you doing on the front end of Hello for Business on the Windows machine, right? Azure multi-factor authentication. We feed that into part of your decision-making process. In the device perspective, and a lot of my tribal customers and Alaska Native customers are using quite a bit of this, and this is why we pick these topics, because this is working remotely is super important this day and time. But B, a lot of you guys already have a lot of these solutions in house. Just a matter of putting it together and falling under this zero trust mindset. So from a device perspective, right? I'm using my EDR, my endpoint detection and risk mitigation. I'm looking at my AV perspective to see if this device is risky or poses a threat to the organization. Right? I can use some partners for my MDM on my mobile landscape, or I'm using Intune, right, to take a look at my mobile landscape. I can take both my PCs and my mobile landscape and decide whether it's compliant or not, based off of policy, right? I can take a look at these the desktop landscape and decide, is it managed, right? Is it part of my domain? Right? Is it hybrid AD joined or what have you, right? Feed that into my signal that we get. And so already we have you covered from an M365 E5 perspective on gathering the needed signal to march through this zero trust mindset. In the decision piece, we have Azure Active Directory conditional access, right? And you see that here. We can accommodate your B2B customers, that if you have any. We can ingest your policies or organization policy, right? We can increase trust by you come in with no MFA, but because you're going maybe somewhere, getting to a highly confidential document or a high business impact application, maybe you want to push back and say, you know what, I want to increase the trust of you, Brian. Why don't you MFA for me? And if you successfully complete multi-factor authentication, then we can talk and proceed, right? That's what you get with conditional access there as part of that decision based on organizational policy. We can do things like remediate leak credentials, right? So if we think Azure Active Directory Identity Protection thinks or believes that you have leak credentials, we can ask you as an end user, hey, why don't you change your password? We believe that you may have been compromised, so you change your password. And if you successfully change your password, then and only then can we continue along your path, right? That's decisions. That's real activity that Zero Trust is giving you as an organization to respond and react accordingly to things that pop up during this process. Then finally, when you talk about rendering your applications, your cloud access, right? We can, from an SaaS application perspective, we can lower access or restrict sessions, right? Of course, that happens with our Microsoft applications, right? Because we're tightly integrated with what we're doing here in M365. And so if I'm coming from an unmanaged device and I'm coming from my home office, I can lower your access or restrict what you can do in the Office 365 suite, right? We have Azure Resource Manager that takes care of what's happening in the cloud, right? We have Cloud App Security, which is our CASB, that can do conditional access, right? An extension of what you've done here organizationally from a policy perspective, and apply that to your SaaS applications. We can also apply that to any other modern applications that you may have, as well as through our Azure Active Directory application proxy, we can apply that same logic and conditional access app control to your legacy applications, right? We're checking the boxes here with this Zero Trust user access. And then finally, we take a look at your documents and we can apply labeling and classification. We can encrypt documents based off of your organizational policy. We can do DLP for you, right? All of those controls over the documents that Zero Trust mandates, we can accomplish. And so Brian's typing a document, he puts in it some PII data, it dings against your organizational policy and says, well, since you have PII data in this document, we're gonna label it as confidential, internal organization only. Brian then attempts to maybe save this to a non-approved SaaS application source, and we block it. That's the coordination. That's the Zero Trust access. That's M365 E5. And then finally, in the mobile space, right, we can take a look at your mobile apps, approved apps. We can look at what's happening in your mobile landscape and apply those same conditional access rules on what you can do on your mobile device and when. Takes care of Zero Trust altogether. It gives you takes care of your signal, your decision, and your enforcement. This is M365. Now, I mentioned briefly conditional access, and just want to march through here on what you get from an Azure Active Directory conditional access perspective. Again, this is the main piece that's going to interpret your organizational policy, right? So we look at 4 levels of feed here. We look at, your identity, right? Are you an employee, a partner? What's your role, right? We take a look at your device. Is it trusted? Is it compliant, right? And these are the how we accomplish that and what can be fed into it. We take a look at your physical and virtual location, right? Your geolocation. Are you on a trusted network, not trusted network? We take a look at your client app and authentication method, right? How you're coming in. We take a look at all of that And then we do apply some things to it. Again, 40 terabytes of data coming in from a conditional access perspective. We apply machine learning to all of that. We apply your policies to all this telemetry we just gathered. Then we do some, as Zero Trust says, we do some real-time evaluation based off of what we know globally and what we as Microsoft see, based off of the baselining and the behavior normalization that's happening in your environment. And we apply some session risk to what you have, what's going on here as part of this request. And so our risk levels go from 1, if you will, to 5, right? For most of it, session risk, even user risk. And so here's where that dynamically change can happen from a Zero Trust perspective. Brian comes in, all things being equal, trusted device, got the location, but his behavior has been off. He typically authenticates 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. Now all of a sudden it's Saturday night at 3 in the morning, and he looks like he's coming in from New Zealand. That may tick your risk score up. If it does, you as an organization can have a policy that says 3 and below, we're fine. Just go carry on as business as usual. If you ever get a session risk of 4, maybe MFA me. Or if you ever get a session risk of 5, then maybe we just want to block you outright and flag somebody, right? That's that dynamic adaptability piece that we talked about that has to be part of Zero Trust. And then finally, controls. Now that we know something, now that we've applied risk scores and we've gathered telemetry, here's what we can do across all of these mediums here. Allow, limit, require MFA, right? To what's happening in the Microsoft side of the house, to modern apps and cloud SaaS applications, to even on-prem and other web applications using proxies. So I got a couple of slides here, and then I just want to walk you through briefly a quick show and tell on the console here, just to kind of look around for those who need a refresher. Again, most of you are using M365, either G3 or G5, but what we offer to accommodate Zero Trust and to get you to that mindset is our Microsoft 365. And it covers 4 main columns, if you will, right? Or solution areas. IAM, Identity and Access Management. We cover your information protection from DLP to labeling and classification, and we cover cloud security, what we do in the cloud space, and we cover threat protection. And if you, as you can see here, and I want to go through all of it, but we integrate up to 40 security categories: anti-phishing, right? Threat intelligence feeds, DLP, device encryption, right? You name it. This is what M365 brings to the table. This is how we can get you to a Zero Trust mindset from an identity perspective. I mentioned it once before, but it's really worth mentioning again. All 40 of those solution areas that I just showed you, all 4 of the core columns, from IAM to threat to cloud to protecting your information, all of that security and intelligence that we throw at those solutions are all built on this, right? And this is unique to Microsoft. I think, again, the number's up to over 8 trillion signals per day. Unparalleled breadth of what we provide by way of what we see every day, from 200 million mobile devices to 630 billion identities that we deal with, right? 600 billion documents, right on down the line. And so we see trends, we see bad your reputation URLs, we see binaries, we see behaviors that are malicious or otherwise, and we build that into the fabric of our security solutions to give you the best threat intelligence possible as an organization. And so once again, these are the 4 areas. I won't repeat this too much here, but these are the columns. Again, I would love to talk in more detail with each of you who have an interest, who want to potentially get to Zero Trust, right? This is how you get there. If you got Microsoft 365 Enterprise E5 or G5, You have it. It's just a matter of now how do we set it up? How do we implement it and get going with zero trust and really make that remote workforce less of a headache and literally give you more control and more security in what you do. This is big picture. This is what we do across M365, but now we talk about the Azure side and infrastructure and the IaaS and the PaaS realm, right? And what we do from a SIEM perspective when you want to bring in IoT and other cloud entities. This is how the big picture fits into it and how we look at overall to accomplish your mission, even outside of M365. And so now I'll pause here while I go to my screen just to show you really quick the console, but I'll pause to see if John and or Bill have captured any pressing questions that need to be answered as of yet.
No, not at this time, Brian.
Okay, so, and John, just a quick check. You can see my browser screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you, thank you. And so this hopefully is review again for a lot of you. I wanted to show you how all of those things, how that telemetry rolls up, right? And for those who were able to attend or will review our last workshop, we talked about threat protection and mitigation, and we kind of went over some of this. But this is how all that telemetry, all those products that we showed you, those 40 solution areas and those 4 core areas between IAM and threat protection and information protection and, you know, right on down the line, cloud, they can't operate in an island. They have to be in the same pond and share telemetry and orchestrate results. And this is a result of that integration here and what we do with M365, right? So at a glance, I can see, right, I got 21% of my devices in a non-compliant state. Okay, that's interesting. 13 users at risk, right? I got 8 devices at risk, right? Users with threat detection, right? Right on down the line. We're sharing that telemetry. We're bubbling up to a single source, right? We even go beyond that. We give you the ability, here to, we create incidents for you. So we gather telemetry, we gather alerts, right? And I'll use this first one as an example. We gather alerts across, and as you can see here, we gather alerts across all of the feeds that we get in your environment. In this particular incident, we've gathered alerts, and it looks like I've gathered 59 alerts. Now, this is 59 alerts out of thousands and thousands of alerts. And the sources of those alerts come from on-prem, on your domain controllers with Azure Advanced Threat Protection. We've gathered it from our threat intelligence with our overall Microsoft Threat Protection. We've gathered sources and alerts from your EDR, which is our Defender product, Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection. We've gathered some alerts that's part of this one incident from your cloud space with our CASB, Microsoft Cloud App Security. Our antivirus have picked up on some things that belong to the same incident, right, which is part of that Defender suite, as well as we've gathered some telemetry from Office Advanced Threat Protection. Think phishing, think safe attachments, and that sort of thing. So we've said, you know, customer, right, we've done the threat intelligence for you. We've done some orchestration, and we believe that 59 alerts belong together, and they're all part of the same incident. Well, let's take a look. And so when I take a look at this incident, it literally walks me through the MITRE attack framework, right? And give me dates behind it, right? Post-delivery detection of suspicious attachment by this user on this PC, right? Email message containing malware, what we did with it, how we mitigated, everything that happened as part of that attack framework, right? We give you the incident information, associated incidents, maybe incidents that were similar to this that happened on another day or the same user, right? And the tags that we used, right? We give you information We give you information on, here's the 59 alerts, right? Here's why we flag these alerts, right? Post-delivery detection of suspicious attachment, right on down the line. Suspicious process injection observed. Here's the devices that were part of this incident. Mind you, I'm clicking once here to gather all of this information. That's why we, Microsoft, and our threat protection gathered all this information together for you. This is all part of that zero trust. If you remember from the earlier chat, we talked about everything that you do in zero trust has to be analyzed as one, has to be automated and visible throughout. This is the result of that visibility. There's one mailbox involved. This particular incident kicked off 6 investigations, right? A hack tool was used, Mimikatz, right? User and IP address reconnaissance, SMB, right? It failed, but this is who captured it, Azure Advanced Threat Protection on your domain controllers. A suspicious LSAS process access on your workstation, right? Right on down the line. We even, to finish it up, we give you the evidence. On top of the alerts that we got from our systems and from our solutions, here are the emails, here are the files, the processes, and the IP addresses. I didn't run one script. It didn't take me an hour. It took me less than 3 minutes to look at this incident, have everything correlated, see the evidence, and give me a great insight and point me in the right direction towards resolution. Finally, I'll take a look on the cloud app security side of the house, right? In this last couple minutes I got here, we give you this information from your SaaS realm, right? And I'm just choosing one of the pieces as part of that zero trust, right? We got, 29 alerts, right? Suspected skeleton alert, risky sign in from an unfamiliar location. There's 68 files infected that came across your SaaS environments, right? I can go one step further, and I'll finish with this page here on alerts. Sorry. So on my alerts, I bubble up right away suspected skeleton key attack, right? Encryption downgrade, right? Risky sign-in from an unfamiliar sign-in. This is all happening in my SaaS world. Again, visibility, threat analytics, and this is what you get as part of your zero trust architecture. And so again, I know there's a lot to it. I sort of went fast here, but I just want to leave you with this screen here as we close out. Zero trust is achievable. It is really a great way to look at enabling your remote workforce. It's a great way to up the ante when it comes to being able to respond to threats, verifying explicitly, and really doing business in a more secure realm. If you have Microsoft 365 E3, you're close. If you have Microsoft 365 E5 or G5, you have the solutions under your umbrella. We'd be happy to talk to you and happy to have a more personal conversation to get you to a zero trust mindset. And with that, John, I think we can close unless there's any further questions.
No questions at this time, but again, Brian, that was excellent. Appreciate everyone's time today. And again, please reach out if you just want to have a conversation, talk about what you currently have, where your concerns might lie. We're here for you. We want to protect you. We want to keep everyone as safe as possible. So please, anytime, reach out.